Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. Sorry about the slight delay there. Had a little technical hitch and had to refresh the screen. So hopefully we are going out. I'm just waiting to see. Oh, yes, there we go. I've just had confirmation that we are going out. Just be aware, I just had a text from the Royal Mail, only it wasn't the Royal Mail, telling me that they tried to deliver a parcel and there was £2 to pay, and so therefore they didn't deliver it. But if I paid, then they would deliver this parcel. I was a bit suspicious by that, of course, so I just went and copied the... well, I did actually go to their website, so I've turned my phone off now, just in case I've downloaded a spam thing. I don't think so. I think they just wanted to get my credit card details by getting me to pay for £2, thinking that I would do that. But it did go to a site that looked like the Royal Mail, very, very convincing, and you would follow it through and give your credit card details. But I didn't do that because I wasn't 100% convinced, and I did a few checks on Google, and it was a spam. So just be aware if you get one from the Royal Mail, a text asking you to pay them a very minimal sum, that it is a scam. There's a lot out there, and you could fall for that so easily by going, oh, it's only £2. I'll just, I'll have that. So I haven't. Was it a royal female, says David Yvette. No. It wasn't. But it is worrying just how easy these things. But of course, the Royal Mail tend not to know your phone number, so why would they text you? Anyway, that aside, hello and welcome. I just thought I'd mention it because that's one of the other things I was just doing. Good afternoon to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Justine Jones, Billabong O'Neill, Philip Hammond and Mary, John F, David Vad, Ollie the Squid, Anne H, Cooper 68, Dudley Sawyer, Lee Lawson, Steve G, and Sensible Paul so far. Excuse me for burping. Alan Sandell had an email from them, actually. I had a parcel en route. Didn't respond. It is a worry because there seems to be more than ever. And, of course, well, maybe I'm just now the recent target. Somebody has bought something with my phone number on it, which isn't a very difficult thing for them. Not a royal female, says Julia Hartley. Not Meghan. No, absolutely. So there we are. Good afternoon. Hope everyone's looking forward to the reading. John F says, I got one yesterday. Your scam video opened my eyes to the world of scamming. There's so much going on. And that was incredibly convincing, I have to say. Except that, here's a little tip that is always worth looking at the URL, at the address, because this one was royalmail.delivery-item.com. And if you check the Royal Mail's actual web page or website, it will be royalmail.com. And all the extensions to things like delivery and things like that will be in front of the words Royal Mail, not at the back. So that the domain, if you know anything about domains, the domain is the last word before the .com. So delivery-item would have been the domain that they'd registered, and then they could tag on things like Royal Mail. It just makes it so legitimate. Then you go on and it's a carbon copy of the site. And you look at it and you just think, well, it looks genuine. Why wouldn't it be? And I looked at the spellings. The spellings were correct. That's another thing. Often if you see loads of different spelling. But I looked at the Royal Mail site, and then I went to a scanning site online, which you can put URLs in if you're a bit unsure to see if it'll scan. And it came up with, said it was malicious, but it also said there were no cookies. Now, the Royal Mail, like any legitimate business, is going to try and put cookies on your website. And you normally have to say yes or no or, you whatever. The Royal Mail would have done that. And also the domain was only registered for a year. I cannot imagine that the Royal Mail has only ever registered their website for a year. It would have been registered for as many years as you could possibly have. So just be aware. We are on Chapter 7, ladies and gentlemen. Jen Colley, hello to you. Linda Kane, good afternoon. And Andrew Norris. There's a YouTube channel called Jim Browning. Yes, he scans the scanned. Scammers, he's really good. I've watched a couple of his videos, actually. He is very good. So, how he does it, I don't know, but it's very clever. Chapter 7. It was Saturday afternoon, and Doris and Doreen were on their way up to Hampstead together. I think it's rather a pet, Doreen was saying, above the roar of the underground train. But you may feel it's perfectly loathsome. You must promise to say so if you do. But Doris was perfectly sure that the flat was a pet, and not in the least loathsome, because Doreen had been telling her so all the week. An artist had lived there, it seemed, and his studio was going to be their living room. The little cubicles that had led off it would make simply the sweetest of bedrooms, Doreen said. And above all things, the flat had got character. From the way Doreen spoke of it, it might have been smoking a pipe when they got there. They had reached Camden Town by now, and Doreen started pushing her way towards the door. It was not easy. The whole of London was going home to its half-day off, and most of them seemed to live somewhere on Hampstead Heath or Highgate Line. They were all ranged all down the carriage like submarine crew at action stations, and getting out onto the platform was as difficult as escaping underwater. But I thought this train went on to Hampstead, Doris said, once they could talk once more. It said so on the indicator. Doreen seemed vexed at her for mentioning it. Oh, it's a different part of Hampstead we're going to, she told her. You can see the trees of Primrose Hill from our windows. Our windows, said Doreen, noticing it was evident that she had already decided on the flat. They went up the escalator and came out onto High Street. Doreen hadn't been to Camden Town before. Just opposite was a splendid concrete and plate glass emporium, a kind of lesser Selfridges. And all down the street outside either side was retail commerce. A bit lower down the scale of grandeur, greengrocers, butchers, tobacconists, fish shops, and a flourishing rival trade in fruit and flowers being carried on from the road in barrows. The pavement was packed with people as though a big excursion steamer had just berthed somewhere up Park Street, and a small body of disabled ex-soldiers soon stood politely in the gutter playing jazz instruments to amuse the trippers. A little further up the street was a super cinema, all chromium and carpet. Doris was a bit disappointed. It was exactly the same as the Elephant and Castle on her side of the river. It didn't seem likely that this was the way freedom and the gay life would lie. But Doreen was impatient. She was lugging Doris across the road in front of the ploughing army of trams and buses and private cars. It's always frightful here on Saturday afternoon, she was saying. I don't know where the people come from. They got onto a 31 bus and started along a road that seemed to Doreen to get a bit steadily drearier, like penetrating further into a rather murky dream. The tram lines made it bumpy, and after they'd shot under a railway bridge, the bus ran beside the grey walls of a goods yard. It was as though somehow they had got round to the back of the stage by mistake, and Camden Town or Primrose Hill or wherever it was Camden Town or Primrose Hill or wherever they were was showing them the side that wasn't really meant to be looked at. Then the conductor said, "Primrose Hill Road," and Doreen dragged Doris out of the bus again. "We'll just go and get the key from the agents, and then in 5 minutes we'll be there," Doreen assured her. He's an absolute little lamb of an agent. I know he'll let us go alone." They had to wait some time for the key, however. The absolute little lamb was still out in the meadows somewhere having his feed, and a cardboard notice stuck in the door said, "Closed for lunch." By the time the little lamb had returned, wiping his moustache, it was nearly 3 o'clock. When they reached the house, the afternoon had already darkened appreciably. The sun had disappeared entirely, and all the sparkle had gone from the day. It was as though someone had deliberately smeared a wet, dirty cloth across the sky. But Doreen was not in the least dispirited. On the contrary, she seemed to take the weather as rather a challenge. Of course, if it looks even the least bit right on a day like this, you can imagine what it'll be like on a sunny day, she said. The house in front of which they were standing was large and detached, and of yellow stucco, a real plaster castle. But whatever family of local barons had inhabited it, they seemed long to have abandoned it and discharged the serfs. In the result, the privet bushes that sprouted out of the black earth in the front garden were ragged and untidy, and the lawn, with the round flower bed in the middle, was gradually reverting to open heath. They went up the stone-flagged path, past the iron gate that had come off its bottom hinge and now rested permanently on the stonework. But at the top of the flight of steps leading up to the massive important porch, Doreen turned to the side through the green wooden doorway that was marked "Tradesman." Doris felt a bit abashed at this, but Doreen seemed to be delighted. "We've got our own separate little entrance, you see," she said over her shoulder. They were at the side of the house now, standing on a short path that was made up of 2 drain covers and an inspection slab laid down by an electric light company. Above them loomed the blank stucco wall, and up this zigzagged a cast-iron fire escape. Rose. Doreen patted it affectionately. "This is my little surprise," she said. "I wouldn't have given it away for the world. I told you that we had our own way in, but I didn't say how." They went up the fire escape together, and at the top they came out onto a large balcony that was really the top of the second-floor bedrooms. Round the balcony there was a trellis that needed nailing up in places, and 1 or 2 tubs with the skeletons of plants in them stood about in the corners. But right in front of them was what they had climbed for. It was a yellow front door, quite newly painted, bearing the words, "The Studio." Beside the door was an ornamental bracket supporting an old-fashioned storm lantern. "I really can't imagine how anyone could have left a darling thing like this. Simply walked out and left it, I mean," Doreen exclaimed. "I went absolutely crazy when I saw it." Doris put her hand up to examine it, but Doreen had already found something else to be excited about. She had got out her key and was opening the yellow front door. "It's a marvellous colour, isn't it?" she said. Doris followed her inside and stood there looking round her. Apparently the storm lantern on its hanging bracket wasn't the only thing that the late tenant had left behind him. Inside the front door was a cardboard box containing a pile of old newspapers, 2 beer bottles, 1 arm of a pair of tongs, and a lady's shoe. Next to it stood a brown earthenware teapot without a spout, and a further huddle of bottles. But Doreen didn't seem to notice things like that. She had gone on ahead and opened the door in front of her. As the wall opposite was nearly 3/4 window, a great rush of dampish yellow light suddenly seeped into the flat. It was like being transported into the middle of a cloud. But there was no doubt about it. It was certainly a fine big room. The walls were sky blue and the doors scarlet. And it was so high it was nearly cubical. No, not cubicle. Is it cubicle? Yeah, cubicle. A cube with the top corners knocked off where the roof slanted sideways. There was no other windows except the enormous tall one, but on the wall facing it, someone, possibly the late tenant, had painted a window. It was a window complete with a flower pot on the windowsill, lace curtains, and the view of the trees beyond. It had been slapped on in good bright colours, like a backcloth to a child's ballet. "That's something else I hadn't told you about," Doreen shrieked at her. She always raised her voice a little when she was excited. "That's what comes from taking a flat from an artist." It occurred to Doreen that the man who had drawn the window couldn't have been a very good artist, but Doreen seemed to like it so much that she didn't mention it. "My goodness, it's cold up here, isn't it?" was all she said. "But look at that marvellous big stove over there," Doreen went on. "Just imagine when it's actually been lit." Black, and about the size of a pillar box, the stove stood on a little brick dais all on its own. A large flue-like drain pipe rose from the back and mounted mysteriously through the ceiling. Written across the front of the stove in large letters were the words, "Paul Albert Frères." Doreen pointed to them in triumph. "You see," she said, "it's French." She spoke as though alone among the nations, the people of France had thought the idea of warming their rooms and... not reading terribly well today. It's not quite so fluid as yesterday. She spoke as though alone among the nations, the people of France had thought of the idea of warming their rooms, and she seemed to be proud of being associated with such people. She opened the door of the stove, and a lot of ash and the remains of a wire flue brush fell out onto the floor. "Of course the whole place needs cleaning up," she said. "It's just as it was left." Doris agreed with her. It was rather as though the artist tenant had absent-mindedly set out one day and had forgotten to come back again. Behind the stove was a large pile of old newspapers, and there was just a hint of a rough house before he'd walked out. Over in one corner stood a bed with a broken spring mattress and its casters off, and underneath the painted window a chair with 3 legs had collapsed onto one side. More cardboard boxes containing saucers, electric light bulbs, nail brushes, bits of cloth, china ornaments, a sink tidy, and a comb, with most of its teeth missing, stood about on the floor. On either side of the window, 2 long curtains, striped like zebra hide, hung down on a tilt because the rod had come off the support on one side. The window worried Doris because there was just too much of it. She raised her eyes to the discoloured sloping ceiling above it. Then a thought struck her. "Supposing there was a war," she said suddenly, "wouldn't this be an awful place in an air raid?" "Oh, my pet, don't think of such things," Doreen told her. "I shall positively always be thinking of air raids now." They went on into the other rooms and found more evidence of sudden flight of the late tenant. There was a cupboard with some ties hanging on a wire, a pullover on which moths had been gorging, another shoe, a man's shoe this time, more newspapers, more beer bottles, and a box of night lights. In the kitchen there was a toothbrush on a hook on the wall, a saucepan still cemented to the gas stove by something that had boiled over on it, milk probably, and in a zinc meat safe, fixed onto the wall, there was a bluish-green wrath of what had once been a loaf of bread. There was even an old newspaper inside the safe as well, as though the previous occupant had been a connoisseur of such things, and had put his extra choice specimen, it was a copy of the Daily Mirror for the 23rd of September 1938, inside for special safety. "Well," Doreen was saying, "now you've seen it all, and I want you to say just what you think of it. I shan't mind a bit if you simply detest it. I only want you to say so." They were back in the big studio again, with the sky blue walls and scarlet doors. and Doreen was standing there with her eyes half closed and a dreamy look spread across her face. "As I see it," she went on, without waiting for Doreen to speak, "we don't want a lot of furniture in here. Only a great enormous divan with a lot of cushions on it over there by the stove, and perhaps an easy chair or two, and a little flat table for drinks, and some of those big glass ashtrays, and my gramophone." She broke off suddenly in delight. Her voice rushed up half an octave, and she began shrieking again. "Just imagine having the dances up here. We could have such marvellous dances." "Do you think the floor is level enough?" Doreen asked. It was a bare floorboard with wide cracks between some of the boards, and the heads of the rows, and the heads of rows of small nails, as though scores of tenants, one after the other, had laid down oilcloth and then ripped it up again. But the question had offended Doreen. You've been simply horrible about my darling little flat ever since you came here," she said. "You haven't said one nice thing about it. If you don't like it, I wish you'd say so. You know I shan't care. It's no good setting somewhere Dutch treat unless we both like it. If you'd rather go on as you are, I quite understand." But Doris was remembering Dulcimer Street, remembering Uncle Henry in his cycling stockings, remembering the smell of cooking from Mr. Puddy upstairs, remembering Connie, remembering a lot of things. "Oh, no, but I do like it. I do really. I like it very much," she said. She doesn't like it. She hates it. Lee Lawson says, "I like the sound of the flat. It could be an interesting place to live. Very desirable and expensive these days." Oh my God, it sounded awful. It sounds like my house. They said goodbye and had gone their separate ways. Doreen to a perfectly marvellous show at the Cambridge with a friend of hers, who was doing a terribly important job and doing it frightfully well, and he was really a perfect dear and screamingly funny when you got to know him. And Doris back to Dulcimer Street. But she didn't go back straight away. She was too much preoccupied and jumpy about things. There she was, with one half of an expensive new residence on her hands and only £20 in the post office. It was like getting married in a hurry and ruining herself. And whose idea was it, she asked herself, hers or Doreen's? It seemed that she had merely mentioned quite casually that she didn't like living at home, and the next thing that she had known was that she was being whisked off to that bare, bleak-looking barn of a place with its silly painted window and hideous scarlet doors somewhere under the rooftops. That window looked as if it were tumbling back into the room, and that still worried her. But so did a lot of other things as well. She was worried about her share of the rent, and about the furniture, about the awful iron staircase at the side of the house, about who would wash up and get the evening meal, and somehow she didn't see Doreen doing it. About the electric light bills and the gas and the water rate, and about getting the place cleaned, about buying an alarm clock so that she could get to the office in time, also about telling Mrs. Josser. She'd been putting it off because there hadn't seemed, any point in breaking the news until she'd actually seen the flat. But now the time had actually come, she felt more strongly than ever like putting it off again. That's why, instead of turning down Kennington Lane in the direction of Dulcimer Street, she went along to the Toledo instead. Is it Toledo? Toledo? The Toledo was new. It had only been open for a couple of months, and she was using it for every purpose for which it had been erected. It was a retreat. It was a huge ferro-concrete refuge from the cares and troubles of life, complete with a marble fountain in the forecourt, carpets like bog moss, the latest organ in South London, Attendants, like chorus girls who went up and down during the performances with their latest kind of antiseptic scent spray, the ice cream and an ice cream fountain, acousticon aids for the deaf, synchroharmonic reproduction, and deep rubber-padded chairs for the refugees. It seemed just the place to go and forget about having to tell Mrs. Josser. And as it turned out, she didn't go alone. She had just left the pay box when somebody spoke to her. It was Percy. He was in his smartest suit, the purple one with a shirt and handkerchief and tie to match, and it was obvious that he was at a loose end. Also, it was obvious that he wanted to be friendly. "Mind if we see this together?" he asked, in the easy manner that he'd been cultivating. No," said Doris. He liked her for accepting it that way. It was all so simple and straightforward. Most of the other girls, he knew, would always fool about in the first before accepting anything, even when they wanted it. But Doris, it was different. She was ladylike. The girl with the antiseptic scent spray had just passed down the aisle when they reached their seats, and their nostrils were full of the musty fragrance of peach and sandalwood. It was like a trip out east for nothing. Percy distended his nostrils and sniffed. Then another girl, a twin sister of the first one with the scent spray, only clothed all in white this time, came along selling ices, and Percy bought 2 threepenny cartons with flat wooden spoons. When he had finished his, Percy took out a pocket comb and combed his hair. He was always trying to keep himself looking nice whenever he was out anywhere. On the screen, a lot of well-developed girls, of the kind that Percy usually liked looking at, were singing a song called Lido Blues. They were dangling their legs over the edge of a swimming pool and wearing very tight-fitting bathing costumes. Ever so often, the song was a long one of the girls would throw up her arms and dive out of sight. But Percy wasn't looking at the film at all. He was looking at Doris. He could see her profile silhouetted against the distance-illuminated exit. It was a nice profile, something he liked looking at. Not exactly his type, he told himself, but all right. Very much all right. She was okay, in a quiet way. He wondered vaguely how much she knew about things. It was something that he always wondered when he went out with the girl. The blonde from the fun fair had been a failure. She had known more about things than Percy did, and she was married. She told him that while they were parked in the car under the trees on Wimbledon Common. Even up to that moment, it had not been a good evening. They'd gone to the Palais de Danse, and the blonde had been a positive menace. "Don't be afraid," she kept saying. "Go on, hold me tighter. I don't bite." In the result, his arms had ached, and he'd got a lot of lipstick smeared across his collar. And then, on top of all that, after he'd gone to the trouble of borrowing somebody's car from the garage to make everything cosy for them, she had to go and tell him that she was married. A bit of a moralist in his way, and he dropped her on principle as soon as he found out. But he was looking at Doris now and had forgotten about the blonde, or at least she and all the other blondes in the world had become merged. It was Doris versus the all-blonde. "If I had a girl like Doris, I'd be okay," he was thinking. "You can see she's all right just by looking at her. She's not like those other mucky blondes. And she's just a little girl. She needs looking after. She needs someone to look after her who knows his way about. She doesn't know anything. She's the sort of little girl who'd get hurt just because she doesn't know what's bad for her. She's only a baby." But because he felt sentimental, he reached out and tried to take hold of her hand. At first, she thought that he wanted to pass him something, but when she discovered what he was up to, she avoided the hot, groping hand that had come working its way towards her. She just sat there as she was, her hands clasped in her lap and her bag over them. Her refusal hurt Percy. Hurt him more than he cared to admit. It was the first time that anyone had ever declined to hold his hand in the cinema, and it hurt him still further to think that after the way so many women had been ready to grant him so much, he should trip over such a little thing like this. But perhaps that was the whole point, he told himself. He'd been going about with the wrong kind of women, the cheap sort. They'd let you do anything, and Doris wouldn't. That was just the difference. That was what made her worthwhile. If I got a decent girl like Doris, I'd be okay, he thought again. I'd be in clover. He stared at the screen for a moment. The swim and sing girls had changed into sombreros and cowboy suits while he wasn't looking, and then he stared back at Doris again. If I got a girl like Doris, he told himself, I'd buy her a cocky little hat and a lot of smart stuff from the Burma Gem. That's the way brunettes look best, with jewellery on. She ought to wear some earrings and a diamond clip. She needs some more lipstick. He eyed her up and down in the darkness, thinking of ways in which he could improve her, and fell back on his old thought again. Oh, she's only a little girl, he told himself. She's only a baby, really. Then a new idea struck him. I'd give her a good time, he told himself. I'd take her round and show her places. I'd watch her come to life. I'd stand by and see her unfold. She'd go places with me. Percy Boone was no longer thinking that he'd be all right, okay, if he had a girl like Doris to take him out. He wanted Doris herself, wanted her desperately. If I had her, he went on, I could give up all those peroxide blondes. I'd leave them to the chaps that wants them. They'd have to get along without me. Doris and me would be different. We'd go to the Palais and the cinema, of course, but everything quite open. Everything okay from the start. I'd take her up the river to Hampton Court. We'd go punting together. I'd buy her a portable gramophone and take it along with us so that we could have the dance tunes. We'd go ice skating. I'd give her a pair of skates with white kid boots and everything if she'd come skating with me. She'd wear a short skirt with a lot of pleats and a tight jumper. I'd show her what money can buy. I bet she's never had a real day of it with a decent sports car and drinks and on the way and all that. We'd go to Brighton. I'd fix the car all right. I'd get hold of something snappy. I'd attend to everything. Leave it all to Percy. The film was drawing to a close now, and Doris let him help her on with her coat. It was just the moment he'd been waiting for. His arm went round her, and he was most unnecessarily tender. As he was bending over her, his cheek brushed across her hair, and he sniffed it expectantly, but he was disappointed. She don't know anything yet, he told himself. She doesn't use perfume. She doesn't even use strong shampoo. She doesn't know anything yet. And we've come to the end of that chapter. What do you make of Percy Boone, eh? Golly, mucky blondes, says Cooper68, rubber-padded chairs. Oh, yes, it's a very strange, isn't it? It's amazing descriptions of that, just so 1940s, or late 30s as it is, isn't it? It's so funny. Percy's such a creep. If I had a girl like her, I'd be all right. It's great. Richard Attenborough plays him so well in the film. Because really, he is so innocent. He is so innocent. That is the sort of the double thing of it. He thinks he knows everything and knows how to be proper and all that. And of course, it's stuff that he's filled his head with in the films. It's quite amazing. Chapter 8, ladies and gentlemen. Chapter 8. Mrs. Vizard was off to enjoy herself, but somehow her appearance didn't suggest enjoyment. At least there was no hint of the riotous about it. The whole effect was formal and rather frigid. She was dressed all in black, with a large, shiny black handbag. It might have been something rather sedate in a way of a funeral that she was going to attend. And that was just how Mrs. Vizard liked to dress. Modern women, girls especially, slouched their way through life. Without corsets and sometimes even without stockings, they slopped. Mrs. Vizard carried herself. She was upright and unsagging. At the moment, however, she was nearly out of her senses with anxiety, and all because of Mr. Squales. She had already gone round once and locked everything up, but now that she remembered him, she made another inspection, pulling at the drawers of her desk and the cupboards, at the lid of the coal bin, just to make sure the catches had caught. She had turned over in her mind the idea of fixing a piece of stamp paper across the outside of her door to see if Mr. Squales had equipped himself with a skeleton key. A whole bunch of them, possibly, which enabled him to break in whenever he fancied. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She went and stood for a moment outside Mr. Squales' door, listening. But she wasn't quite sure what it was she expected to hear. Whatever it was, she heard nothing. The sense of mystery deepened. Why should he go out only at night time? She asked herself. It was almost as if he were afraid to face the daylight. He was never out for very long on these furtive evening sorties. It was usually well before midnight when he got back. But whatever went on in those intervening hours was evidently strangely wearing. She had met him once when he was coming in, and seen his face in a downward shaft of light from the gas bracket in the hall. It was the face of an exhausted man, with heads of perspiration all along the with beads of perspiration all along the forehead. A burglar? Could that be it? It would explain everything. A burglar here in the next room beside her. And a murderer too, for all she knew. Either that or someone who preyed, she didn't know how, on women. Whichever of these, she was resolved to get rid of him. But there was something else tonight to occupy her mind, for she was on her way to keep an appointment, and no ordinary appointment at that. Nothing less than one with the late Mr. Vizard, in fact. For a few tense privileged moments, she was going to be allowed to peep behind the veil, to penetrate, to voyage astrally, and all for £0.50. The members of the South London Psychical Society had been specially circularised for the occasion. The new medium was as gifted as he was reluctant, it seemed. The other recipient of frequent and informative message from the other side... The recipient of frequent and informative messages from the other side, he was perfectly content to remain in exclusive possession of them. Nothing less than 2 guineas would persuade him. There was 6 of these subscribers already had arrived by the time Mrs. Vizard got there, and Mr. Clinkwell, the secretary, was passing with bright bird-like movements from one to the other, a tray of sandwiches in one hand, a plate of bridge rolls in the other. He was a quick, nervous little man, always up on his toes and anxious to make things successful. Full of new ideas, he was always proposing fresh schemes. Visits to neighbouring psychic societies, pilgrimages to homes of famous mediums, trips to haunted houses. Altogether, he was the driving force of the society, very different from the decayed and unprofitable clergyman Dr. Glassy White, who had preceded him. Dr. Glassy White exclusively theological training had finally landed him in trouble on the financial side, and there was nearly £50 worth of subscriptions that could never be traced. And he'd resigned. But Mr. Clinkwell was a born accountant. Under his guidance, the Spirit showed a profit. Mr. Chinkwell hopped forward to meet Mrs. Vizard. "Good evening," he said. "I'm so glad you are able to come. The medium has not arrived yet, but I'm told he is never late. Fish paste or sandwich spread." The other women who were there were already munching. They were building up their strength for the experience, and Mr. Chinkwell was plying them. Between single ladies and light refreshments, there is, he had discovered, an irresistible attraction. And though they paid 6pence a head for them, on top of the half-crown they still liked to have a plate passed to them and say, "Thank you," as if it had all been a friendly charity of Mr. Chinkwell's. What was more, they ate heartily. Even Mrs. Jan Bly, not Bly, B-L-Y, but Bill. Is it Bill? I suppose B-L-Y, Bill. Even Mrs. Jan Bill, a widow of great wealth from Knightsbridge. It was her car that stood outside, glittering and imposing like a hearse. She had tucked into the sandwiches along with the rest. By 5 to 8, there were 13 of them, and Mr. Chinkwell was getting worried. But at 8 o'clock sharp, it showed an almost psychic awareness of the time. The doorbell rang, and it was the medium, the great Qualito. There was something strangely electric about his coming. One of the members, a schoolmistress from Sydenham, said that she could positively feel the man. It was, she said, exactly as though someone had run a long cold thumbnail across her spine. But even so, that didn't mean the séance could begin at once. Mr. Chinkwell had brought back a message that Qualito was resting and did not wish to be disturbed. He had asked for a cup of coffee and a cigarette, and it seemed that there was no possibility of rushing him. The Sydenham schoolmistress declared that a sudden loosening of tension in her spine denoted that the medium was probably dozing. But at 8:25, everything was ready, and they all trooped through into the séance room. It was a bare, lofty room, sparsely furnished, with a long oval table. A small, red-domed light glowed in the middle. The table was surrounded by deal chairs, and a second-hand sideboard supported the apparatus, a megaphone, a canary cage with a white silk handkerchief inside, a planchette, a pair of tambourines, and a deep bowl of mercalized wax. Most of the objects were painted with luminous paint so that the spectators could keep an eye on what was happening to them once the lights had been turned out. But the mercalized wax was for examination afterwards. It was there specially for those mediums who produced spirit hands out of themselves and tantalizingly reabsorbed them. The idea was simple but effective. The medium was invited to materialize the ectoplasmic hand inside the wax. Then, when the séance was over, a cast of the pseudopod could be cast in plaster, and the investigators could examine this hand from nowhere. It was all very modern and scientific and advanced. And Mr. Chinkwell had calculated that he could sell the plaster casts of pseudopods for 5 guineas apiece to no fewer than 137 corresponding societies. The only thing that was lacking was the medium who could actually produce the pseudopods. But sometimes at dull séances, when Mr. Chinkwell could have been thinking of the other side and the dawn lands and the happy vale, he had just sat there multiplying 137 by 5 and adding in the odd shillings. Quolito, as it turned out, was one of those mediums who couldn't stand a strong light even before the séances. He had apparently been sitting in total darkness for the past 10 minutes. So, the lights in the séance room were turned down in readiness, and only the red light on the table, a kind of satanic night light, was left burning. Then the door at the end opened, and Quolito was led in. He sat down in the big armchair at the head of the table, with Mrs. Jan Bill on one side of him and Mrs. Vizard at the other. The schoolmistress had asked to be allowed to sit up there beside him, but Mr. Clinkwell had been compelled to refuse. If she felt long, cold thumbnails running down her spine when she was in another room, he didn't like to think what she would feel when she was actually touching him. Quolito himself seemed admirably composed. He had already changed into slippers, and now he took off his collar and tie and loosened his waistcoat. Then, sitting back limply in his chair, he hung his hands over the side as if they didn't belong to him, and in a deep, un-English voice, he addressed the company. "Let us form a leaving circle," he suggested. "Circles are so strong." The schoolmistress almost swooned when she at last came into contact with this powerful man, even though he was 7 places away from her. It was as though invisible sparks, as she described it, leapt from the fingertips of the 2 neighbours and kindled something inside her. For quite a time, however, absolutely nothing happened. Quolito seemed merely to be resting at the society's expense, and for all the good he was, he might have stayed away altogether. It was the alert Mr. Chinkwell who was first to notice that his breathing had changed. It was now deep and laboured, as if, instead of just sitting there, that he was running, actually running. And it was getting more laboured still. It was as if the man were choking. Finally, he said something so muttered and indistinct. No one could catch his speaking. But what was it? It didn't sound like his voice at all. Quolito's voice was smooth, like olive oil, and this other voice was higher, older. It was as though a man of 70 were in the chair with him. Then, quite suddenly, the voice, whosever voice it was, came through quite clearly. It spoke to them. There was Quolito, low in his chair, moaning and shuddering, and there was this voice speaking through him. "I am Payam," it said. "I greet you. I cannot see you plainly, but I greet you." There was a pause after this, and Mr. Chinkwell, after allowing Payam a few seconds' grace to see if he wanted to add anything, addressed him. "Where are you, Payam?" he asked. "Among the mountains," Payam answered. "What mountains?" "High mountains." "Are you alone?" "Yes." "How long have you been there?" "Time has no meaning where I am. There is no sunrise and no sunset. It is always morning. It is very beautiful." "What do the mountains look like?" "They are snow-covered, like clouds seen from far off at sea." "Is it cold?" the schoolmistress asked in a tense voice charged with emotion. "There is neither heat nor cold where I am," he reproved her. Reproved. "Heat and cold are diseases." Isn't even the snow cold?" Mrs. Jan Bill asked. But this time Payam declined to answer. "What were you on earth Payam, Mr. Chinkwell put in hurriedly. He didn't want the evening spoiled for the others simply because Mrs. Jan Bill was badgering their visitor with awkward questions. On the other hand, he couldn't afford to offend Mrs. Jan Bill. "I was delicate. A lama," Payam said simply. "Tibet was my home. I lived in a monastery with 200 other lamas. My earthly name meant water stillness." Is it not lamas? Lamas. Is it lamas? L-A-M-S. I don't know what that is. What is lamas? Lamas? "My earthly name meant water stillness. I was renamed when I came here. My new name is brightly shining, but they call me Messenger." "I thought you said you were alone." It was Mrs. Jan Bill who had spoken. "I am." "Then who is there to speak to you?" she demanded. Payam was silent for a moment, as if sulking. "The birds," he said at last, "and the flowers." "Flowers? Up there among all that snow?" "Snowflowers," said Payam tartly, and refused to be drawn further. "Have you a message for anybody here?" Mr. Chinkwell inquired. "I have a message for everyone," Payam replied. "Confucius gave it to me. It is this: an eagle falling from a great height may capture a young lamb, but a lily gathers sweetness without moving." "Is that all?" said Mrs. Jan Bill, pointedly. Only by realizing our all-oneness shall we attain peace," Payam continued, as though he had not noticed the interruption and was speaking for himself now. "Speed is no substitute for contemplation. The love of mother and child is no more gracious than the lust of a serpent for its victim. The stars show us the way, but we do not follow them. Our pride is like slippers of lead upon feet. Even the all-nothingness is part of the all-oneness." "Will you speak direct to one of us?" Mr. Chinkwell suggested. "Bring us tidings, perhaps?" He knew how much these personal messages were always appreciated. Payam considered the point for a moment. "There is one here who is unhappy," he said at last. "A woman. She is like an empty bottle containing no wine. She is desolate. She longs for the wine, but it is withheld. She has searched for the truth, but been disappointed. She searches for a strong arm to rest on, but she cannot find it. Her breasts ache. She weeps for her misfortunes. I tell her to be happy. She is like a harp that the wind plays on. The music is faint and far off, but somewhere there are ears which hear it." The schoolmistress from Sydenham gave a great gulp, and because her hands were very engaged, she could not get her handkerchief, and sat there sniffling. She could hardly bear to have him go on. But Payam apparently had finished. His message was delivered. It was Qualito, and not the Tibetan Lama, who sat there. And as the spirit left him, he began twitching and jerking so violently that Mrs. Vizard and Mrs. Jan Bill could scarcely hold him. There were those shuddering groans again, and as he jerked his head, little flecks of sweat from his forehead fell on Mrs. Jan Bill's expensive skirt. Then the breathing quietened, and Qualito's real voice spoke to them. "Give me a light," he said anxiously. "Give me light. I am frightened." Mr. Chinkwell had been ready for this moment. He bent forward and kicked on the switch with his foot. There was a sudden blaze, and no one could see anything for a moment. They screwed up their faces and shook themselves. One or two wiped their foreheads. Then everyone turned towards the medium, who was lying back in his chair, exhausted. Mrs. Vizard was the first to turn, and when she turned and saw that it was... Mrs. Vizard was one of the first to turn, and when she turned, she saw that it was the hand of Oh, for Christ's sake. Mrs. Vizard was the first to turn, and when she turned, she saw it was the hand of Mr. Squales that she'd been holding. "It's my belief," Mrs. Jan Bill was saying in a Knightsbridge whisper, "that the man's an impostor." Mr. Squales was the medium. And there we come to the end of that chapter. Sorry, I messed up the last bleeding line, which is so typical of me because I know it's the last line and I always mess it up. Mr. Squales was the medium. Is he an imposter? We will have to wait and see for our next visit to the whatever it's called. I can't remember without looking at the book. London Belongs to Me. Thank you. By Norman Collins. I hope you enjoyed it. It's good fun reading that. Sorry about the few trips and things. Mr. Personality. Sounds like a dog who needs neutering. Oh, yes. Pie in the sky. Llama as if it has an R in it. The Dalai Lama. Yes, sorry, I was thinking of llamas as in the animals. When he first said, "I'm a llama," I was thinking, llama? That can't be right. Llama as in, you know, the alpaca. The Dalai Lama. Llamas in the Buxton, llamas in the waterfall. Michael White, absolutely. Sensible Paul, waving. Fantastic read today. Cheers, Richard. Knightsbridge Whisper. Yes, in a Knightsbridge Whisper. I think the man is a poster. Ed Loud says, "I'm looking forward to catching up with this later. I'm sure it's great fun, as always." Thanks in advance, Richard. Had to travel to care for my father due out from hospital. Brilliant. Oh, the plot thickens, says Anne. It does indeed. I must go and throw some logs on the fire because I forgot to do that, so I'm hoping it's not gone out. But there we are. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch up with you next time. Take care, one and all. Nice to see you. Ta-ta for now. Bye-bye.